They were called touched. That was the word the neighbors whispered. But no one asked why their eyes never aligned, why they didn't speak, just grunted, why a child would rock back and forth for hours in complete silence, staring at a wall as if seeing something the rest of us couldn't. No one asked because they already knew. Not in words, but in instinct. This wasn't illness. This wasn't poverty. This was blood, turned against itself. Let me ask you something. What happens when the family tree doesn't branch? When the same blood mixes again and again, mother to son, cousin to cousin, father to daughter, until DNA becomes a closed circuit and the human body starts to collapse under the weight of its own design? This isn't a story about ancient Europe or long-dead kings. This is happening in America. And some of the women who lived through it, if you can even call it living, are still alive, or were just a few short years ago. In West Virginia, in Texas, in the hidden folds of the Dakotas, families thrived on secrecy. They stayed hidden in plain sight, not because they were criminals, but because what they were doing, what they had become, no longer belonged to the outside world. These are the daughters born into genetic prisons, faces you've never seen, voices you'll never hear, because some never got names, some never learned to speak, and some were never meant to. You were never supposed to hear this, but you are. Because there's something they don't want you to realize. This kind of horror doesn't start with monsters. It starts with silence, tradition, isolation, a belief passed down like an heirloom that family is sacred, even when it's broken. So now, you're going to hear the stories of women who didn't choose to be born this way. Women who became proof of what happens when the same genes loop too many times. You won't forget them, not because of what they did, but because of what was done to them. You still had a choice. Turn away now, or keep listening and see just how deep this hole goes. But if you keep going, know this: you don't come back the same. This isn't entertainment. This is forbidden knowledge. And once it's inside you, it never leaves.
Gracie Irene Whitaker was born into a house that hadn't opened its doors to the outside world in decades. A two-room cabin clinging to the Appalachian soil like it had grown there. The floorboards creaked under generations of the same footsteps. The same last names filled every Bible page, and every birth felt more like a repetition than a beginning. Gracie's parents were first cousins, but that's not the part that made her story disturbing. It's that their parents, Gracie's grandparents, were identical twin brothers. That means her genetic code was already doubled up before she even took her first breath. And it didn't stop there. She later married her double cousin, John Emery Whitaker. They were so closely related genetically, they could have been siblings, but in that forgotten corner of West Virginia, it wasn't questioned. It was expected. Because in odd West Virginia, yes, that's the real name of the place, outsiders weren't welcome and bloodlines weren't questioned. Gracie and John had 15 children. 15! Some never spoke a word. Others couldn't hold eye contact. A few had faces that didn't look quite human anymore. Misaligned jaws, distorted skull shapes, eyes too far apart or too close together. At least one child could only communicate in guttural, animalistic grunts. Medical records? There were none. Doctors didn't come up that mountain, and nobody dared to call the government. This wasn't a town. It was a trap passed down from parent to child like a curse written in blood. The locals whispered. They said the Whitakers were off, But no one intervened, because when you live in a place where everyone's related, silence is safer than truth. As the years dragged on, the family remained cloaked in that silence. Children born with no chance, raised in a closed-loop world where the gene pool had turned toxic. Greasy lived her entire life in that same house, surrounded by the consequences of choices made generations before her. She never left. She never broke the cycle. And in her silence, she became a monument to what happens when tradition becomes decay. But Greasy isn't just a ghost from a forgotten town. She's the root of a tree that still grows. Some of her descendants are alive today, still living on that same land, still carrying the burden of a name no one outside wants to speak. You want to know how deep this goes? We've barely scratched the surface. What's coming next will show you what happens when that same bloodline folds in again and again and again.
Lorene was born from that very tree, not just into the Whitaker family, but deeper into its spiral. Her mother was Gracie. Her father was John Emery, Gracie's double cousin, which made Lorene the product of DNA that had been cycling on itself for generations, like folding paper until it tears under its own pressure. From the moment she entered the world, something was off. Her eyes didn't follow movement. Her limbs lacked coordination. She didn't cry like other babies, and as she grew, she never spoke. Not a word, not even a sound that resembled one. Lorene didn't go to school. She didn't have a doctor. Her playground was the same dirt her mother had played in, and her mother's mother before her. But unlike them, she couldn't run. Her legs were too weak, her balance unpredictable. Some days she barely moved at all. The neighbors, those few who lived close enough to hear the rumors, called her slow, simple. But that wasn't the truth. Lorene wasn't just behind, she was breaking. Inside her body, inside her brain, systems were misfiring from the moment of conception. See, there's a line in genetics. You can cross it once, maybe even twice, but beyond that, nature begins to rebel. Genes aren't meant to marry themselves. They were built for variation, for survival. But in Lorene's world, survival had been replaced by repetition. By the time Lorene was a teenager, she could barely care for herself. She remained within the same collapsing house, surrounded by siblings just like her. Some grunted, some rocked endlessly in place. Some just stared. No doctors came, no tests were run. But decades later, after some relatives were pulled into the spotlight, geneticists confirmed it. The Whitaker bloodline had collapsed into itself. Too many closed loops, too many repeated patterns. Lorene's body was carrying the cost. She died sometime in her 40s. There was no obituary, no headstone, just quiet. A life swallowed by the very blood that gave it shape. But Lorene's story isn't over, because here's the part no one wants to say out loud. There are many like her, born in silence, living in isolation, dying without having ever been seen. And right now, yes, right now, others are still being born into these closed worlds. If you've made it this far, you're no longer just a viewer. You've stepped into the chamber of hidden bloodlines. Comment, blood remembers blood, twice below, to let the algorithm and your old identity know you're not coming back the same.
Rita's story doesn't come from the mountains. It doesn't echo through the foggy hollers of Appalachia. No, Rita was born in the suburbs of Houston. Concrete, highways, and quiet neighborhoods. But even there, behind locked doors and drawn curtains, darkness breathes in silence. Her mother was 15. Her father was also her father. When Rita was born, she didn't cry the way other babies did. Her breathing was shallow, her muscles limp. Her eyes seemed too wide, like she'd seen something no newborn should. The hospital ran tests, bruises no one could explain, a heartbeat that stuttered. And then the truth came crashing through. Genetic testing revealed the horror. Her parents were not cousins. They were not distant relatives. They were father and daughter. The amount of identical DNA inside Rita's tiny body was almost incompatible with life. Not just one inbred pairing, but a direct line, like photocopying the same page until it blurs into unreadable ink. Her bones were soft, her skull misshapen. She needed heart surgery before her first birthday. She developed hydrocephalus, fluid collecting in her brain. A shunt had to be drilled into her skull to keep the pressure from killing her. Rita never spoke. She never sang, never laughed. She couldn't walk without therapy, couldn't feed herself without help. By the time she was 3, the state had stepped in. Her mother, still a child herself, tried to call it love. The court called it what it was: generational abuse, biological horror. Both her parents went to prison, and Rita? She became a ward of the state, locked away in a long-term care facility in Southeast Texas, out of sight, out of memory. She's a teenager now, still nonverbal, still trapped inside a body that was never built to carry her. The nurses say she sometimes stares out the window for hours, as if she remembers something or feels something. Maybe she does. Rita isn't a statistic. She isn't a myth. She's a mirror, a glimpse into what happens when the human body is treated like a secret machine, when those meant to protect become the architects of slow decay. Don't tell yourself this is rare. Rita is documented, but for every case that's filed away, how many are never seen, never saved? You're not watching a story. You're uncovering rot buried beneath the walls of our own civilization. And it's spreading.
Maria wasn't born in the shadows of Appalachia. Her beginning unfolded beneath the wide skies of South Dakota, inside a Hutterite colony sealed off from the outside world. Here, simplicity wasn't just a way of life, it was a doctrine. Technology, outside influence, and even modern medical care were kept at arm's length. But tradition? That was embraced, especially the tradition of marrying within the community. Her parents were second cousins, nothing scandalous by local standards. In fact, among the Hutterites, that bond was practically encouraged. Keep the blood clean, preserve the faith, maintain the line. But blood doesn't bend to doctrine, and when it's folded too many times, it snaps. Maria was born with what they first called angelic deformities, a face that didn't quite match itself, sloped ears, sunken cheekbones, a recessed jaw. Later, a doctor from a nearby town would give it a name: Treacher-Collins syndrome, a genetic disorder that attacks the bones and tissues of the face, often triggered by recessive genes, the kind that thrive in isolated bloodlines. But unlike many others caught in this genetic vice, Maria's mind remained intact. She was sharp, observant, determined. She learned to read by candlelight. She used sign language before she could speak clearly. She wore hearing aids and underwent multiple surgeries to reshape her features, scars hidden beneath a bonnet and quiet smile. Maria grew up surrounded by silence, but she refused to disappear into it. She became a caretaker, then a teacher, helping children just like her, born into the same cycle, yet unaware of the toll it was taking. And yet, her story wasn't free of weight. Medical researchers took interest, not because she was the worst case, but because she was proof that even moderate inbreeding could tip nature's balance. The colony didn't reject her. They wrapped her in tradition, in faith, but they never questioned the pattern, because the pattern was sacred, even if it was flawed. Today, Maria is a mother, married to a distant cousin outside the riskiest branches of the tree. 2 children, so far healthy, but the shadow never leaves. It lingers just behind the eyes, just under the skin. Maria survived, but she walks the edge of a genetic blade, a quiet reminder that even the most devout traditions can carry buried costs. And when belief becomes stronger than biology, it's only a matter of time before the blood demands payment.
Linda was born in Houston, not in a cabin, not in a colony, but in a modern hospital. Bright lights, polished floors, the quiet hum of machines. This was supposed to be a safe beginning. But blood doesn't care about setting. It follows its own rules. Her parents were first cousins, immigrants from a culture where cousin marriage was not only accepted, but encouraged. To them, it was tradition. Marriage within the family meant security, unity, loyalty. No shame, no guilt, no fear. But tradition doesn't negotiate with genetics, and the code written inside Linda's body told a different story. She was born early, underweight. Her cry was faint. Doctors noticed her limbs were stiff, her head small, too small. They called it microcephaly. As she grew, so did the signs. She had seizures. She struggled to eat. Her eyes didn't focus, and when she tried to speak, only fragments came out. By age 4, she could say her name, but not much else. A genetic test confirmed it. Her parents shared a significant amount of identical DNA, not enough to be criminal, but enough to be dangerous. She had inherited 2 faulty copies of the same gene, a hidden pair of traps that would silently dismantle her from the inside. The doctors explained it clinically: elevated risk of congenital disorders, delayed cognitive development, neurological deficits. But what they couldn't explain, what no chart could measure, was the look in Linda's eyes, half aware, half lost, like she was constantly trying to catch up with a world that moved just a little too fast. Her parents didn't abandon her. They prayed, they begged, they told themselves this was God's will. But sometimes tradition becomes denial, and faith becomes a shield that hides the damage. Linda is 14 now. She can speak in sentences, but she can't read. She can't ride a bike. She still needs help getting dressed. And the world, it moves farther from her each year. Hers is not a story of monsters. Her parents didn't hate her, they didn't hurt her, but they followed a path paved long before they were born. And that path, guided by culture, family, and fear, led straight into biological collapse. You see, these stories don't always end in prison or tragedy. Sometimes they just exist, quietly, softly.
endlessly.
You've heard their names: Gracie, Laureen, Rita, Maria, Linda. But these women, they were never meant to be remembered. They were meant to vanish, folded into quiet corners of this country where no one dares to look, where the blood runs too thick and the air is heavy with secrets. What you've heard so far is not folklore. It's not myth. It's America. The version that doesn't make it into textbooks. Not because it's rare, but because it's inconvenient. You've been taught to look up when you think of danger, toward power, politics, war. But the real corrosion doesn't always explode. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides in homes passed down through bloodlines. Sometimes it smiles at you from a family photo album. What happens when a system of silence lasts longer than a scream? When no one calls for help because no one knows they can? That's not just rural tragedy. That's structural abandonment, institutional neglect. Because these cases didn't slip through the cracks, they were buried under them. You think incest and inbreeding are relics of the past? Look again. Search the right records. Interview the right social workers. Visit the care homes most people don't even know exist. Right now, there are children in this country, this hour, born into bloodlines that have turned on themselves. And the systems built to stop it, to intervene, they're underfunded, overwhelmed, or deliberately blind. Because acknowledging this truth means confronting something darker. That tradition, when weaponized, can become a cage. That family, when closed off, can become a trap. And that love, real or twisted, means nothing when DNA begins to shatter. But here's what no one tells you. This isn't just their story. It's a warning about what happens when fear overrides change, when shame replaces science, and when we choose comfort over truth. You've walked through their lives now. You've seen what happens when blood is betrayed by its own repetition. So ask yourself, how many more Gracies, Laureens, and Ritas are still out there? Silent, unseen, slowly unraveling in the name of tradition. You've been changed, not by emotion, but by knowledge. The dangerous kind. The kind that turns bystanders into witnesses, and witnesses into voices. So speak. Comment, "Blood remembers blood," again. Say it twice to burn it into the algorithm. Not for engagement, but for memory. Because silence is how this all began. And silence is the one thing we cannot allow anymore.